Good afternoon, good morning. I want to begin our Women Get on Board speaker series today by acknowledging the land in which I live is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. The Upper Canada treaties cover this area, and it's the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, the Wampum Agreement, and is directly adjacent to the Haudenosaunee Treaty territory. Today, this is home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to enjoy the natural surroundings of this territory. I encourage all of us to become actively involved in understanding why land acknowledgements are important in understanding Indigenous histories and contemporary Indigenous issues in Canada. Hi, I'm Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get on Board. We are a member-based company that connects, promotes, and empowers women to corporate boards. We are over 950 members across Canada with diversity in our Women Get on Board membership, and our goal is to get more women on boards. Women Get on Board is delighted to be hosting this virtual speaker series event, and our sponsor today is Advisory Board Center. When I look them up online, I love their tagline. So Louise, I am going to do a little promotion for you today. Whether you're looking to start or expand an advisory board or considering a seat on one of them, you won't want to settle for anything but the best practice, the best structure, the best standards, and the best connections. This is where the Advisory Board Center excels. They are an independent, global, professional body that is specifically designed to bring strong foundational best practice frameworks and professional excellence to support the rapidly growing advisory sector. We are delighted to have Louise Broekman today, the founder of the Advisory Board Center. Her bio speaks for herself, but I will just take the lead story here. Louise is an award-winning entrepreneur, researcher, business advisor, and founder of the professional body for advisory board sector with industry and governance recognition for her contributions in the business sector. So without further ado, we're super excited to have you here, Louise, to talk about the state of the market for advisory boards in 2024 and beyond. Over to you, Louise.
Thanks, Deborah. It's lovely to be here, and greetings from Brisbane, the Turrbal land of where we live, and I recognise our elders past, present, and also for the many years to come in the future. So Deborah, lovely to be here, and I'd like to share with you today the research that's been conducted on the advisory board sector around the world, and it's called the State of the Market Report. And this report really outlines what's happening in the advisory board sector, where it stands today, but also where it's heading as well. We produce this report every 2 years, and this one is the third edition that's come out. We're busy at the moment compiling the report that'll be released later next year. Just to give you a bit of an outline, the Advisory Board Centre, our purpose is to really raise the standard of advisory boards around the world for individual professionals, but then in turn for the organisations that they serve. Our organisation is 7.5 years young, and I started it because an advisory board changed my life in my past business. We wanted to go global, and I wanted to make sure that I was really very confident in the decisions that I was making. In that business, I'd worked really hard to build it, and I didn't want to lose control of the asset that I worked so hard to build. So I didn't want a full governance board, so I'd lose control of that decision making. So I decided I want to have an advisory board to support my decisions, but I would still make those decisions and maintain control. And that was life-changing for me. In that 5-year period, we built that business to 135 offices in 8 countries within 5 years. When I sold that business, I had this eternal sense of gratitude for what the advisory board had done for me personally, but also for the business. And I come from an intellectual property development background, so I decided to invest 5 years to research, test, and validate advisory board structures around the world, and to deeply consider the ethical boundaries between a governance board, an advisory board, the executives, as well as consultants. And in that research, we found quality advisory boards really are driven by a quality chair with a really good charter. So the chair really must understand what they're doing. At that time, we also found there was no professional body looking after the advisory board sector at all around the world. So we decided at that time, which was 7.5 years ago, to build the world's first professional body for the advisory board sector, not to control it, but to be the stewards and really support the ecosystem of enabling people to be able to collaborate, but also have a foundation of what good looks like. So we continue to grow this sector in a way that everybody's really proud of the impact that it makes. So we have a 100-year strategy. So we got 93 years to go to continue to professionalize the sector. So today we're in 31 countries. We run our programs in Singapore, Dubai, London, Paris, Toronto as of this year, which we're very excited about, as well as New York. I'll just share a bit about the trends. And so Korn Ferry and Financial Times both referred to our research report and really reviewed it and identified it as being a hot new governance trend. I didn't say that, they did. And it's really interesting because advisory boards is not a governance board. So Deborah, I'd really be keen to bring you into the conversation if that's okay. Have you seen a shift in the trend in the utilisation of advisory boards?
Well, I think it's a great trend. I had my first opportunity to be on advisory boards in the early 2000s, so before these best practices and frameworks were put in place. And I think that they're a great augmentation. And I think the ethical divide between a governance board and advisory board is really important to understand. And I loved how you set the context of what it meant for you and why they weren't there to do the decision making. They were there to advise. And as the decision maker, as the owner, as the founder of the company, that it's so valuable. And I think the shift can change. Sometimes companies are in early stages and need certain skill sets at a time. And so I think the evolution of it being a new governance trend, I think is so important. And I do believe that there's a time and place, and the chair of the advisory board is critical to the success of the advisory board.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll do a bit of a deeper dive on some of the key trends that are actually driving that. If I just look at the structure of what I'd like to go through, we'll go through the two mega trends that are driving new activity, the professional snapshot, but also look at some of the market trends and impact as well. So there are two key mega trends that are driving new advisory board activity. The first one is the real shift in the relationship between the governance board and the advisory board. Traditional view, and I must admit 5 years ago, I was one of those that was espousing that's either a governance board or an advisory board, and they're very separate, where the governance board is a decision-making model and it's binding. And it's a serious undertaking, and rightly so, when you can go to jail for the decisions that are made or not made, but it's also binding on the organisation to implement on those decisions. An advisory board is not a decision-making model, as Deborah mentioned. It's a problem-solving model. So the decisions stay with the organisation. So it gives room for really robust debate, critical thinking. It is a thinking system. So in the past, we used to talk about them being very separate functions. Today, they're working side by side and one working in conjunction with the other. So we don't talk about governance boards anymore. What we do talk about is governance systems. And so if we look at the Financial Times talking about governance boards are getting smaller, but Harvard Business Review talks about the actual model of governance is getting bigger. So when you put the two of those together, you then really realise that the actual function of governance is getting much broader. which means that advisory boards have got this very important role to play in supporting governance boards in making really well-informed decisions, and not only governance boards, but also executives as well. If I just do a little bit of deeper dive on that, the dilemma that that we face today is that I don't think any of us can ignore the constraints placed on governance board directors with the personal liability and the personal constraint around the work that they do. And it's getting more difficult to be able to get their head around everything that needs to be done. So agendas are just getting bigger at the governance board table. We had a summit earlier this year where one of our members is both on a governance board and advisory boards. And in his governance board roles, he has their monthly report, which is 600 pages long, that they need to get through to then make decisions in the governance board meeting. So my question is, how do they do that? And so as directors, we all need to think about what's the quality of our decision making. We've got to cover off on so much more than what we've ever had to do before. And so what do? Do we work harder? Do we bring on, do we make longer meetings, which I don't think anyone really wants to do? Do you bring on more directors? Do you bring on more specialist consultants, more expertise within the executive team? Or do you build advisory boards or more committees, or just wing it and hopefully no one notices actually that we're not covering off on everything in the way that possibly we should? And so this is a new role for advisory boards beyond the traditional market. And I'll talk about the traditional models for advisory boards, but this is a very important role that's happening worldwide that we can't ignore. The other part of the market, which is the other trend, is just the absolute increase in the stakeholder economy, and with the stakeholder engagement required in decision-making cycles, where it's regulated in the UK about having quality stakeholder engagement within their Corporations Act. It's coming our way in Australia. It'd be interesting to hear what happens in Canada as well. But the market is demanding directors to make different decisions. So how do they do that in a way that actually engages stakeholders, but also makes it really safe for the directors as well that have to make those decisions? So this is driving stakeholder engagement, things like customer advisory boards, thought leadership advisory boards. In the aged care sector in Australia, advisory boards have just been regulated in the aged care sector. So our most vulnerable stakeholders in our community have a voice. And I think this is really an important trend that we can't and we shouldn't ignore with regards to vulnerable customers. So when we think about the profession of advisory boards, the advisory board sector, we started mapping the advisory board sector in 2019, and there were 1.3 million advisory board professionals around the world. Today, it's more than doubled that, of over 2.6 million, which is really great to be able to see the increase of the individuals choosing to have advisory boards as a profession. But it's also problematic. We're the only professional body in the world for advisory boards. And so if we've got a lot of people entering the advisory board space and they don't know what they're doing, it can create a lot of harm if people are winging it along the way. But it is very promising that advisory boards are being seen as a really good professional option with regards to balancing out a board portfolio as well as a portfolio career. Deborah, I'd really love to hear what you see in the market there.
Well, I'm very encouraged by this news because I do love that it's trending upward. And I think in this kind of world of VUCA that I would say for whether it's boards or advisory boards, it's volatility, there's uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And so when you kind of wrap around with geopolitical cybersecurity, it is a very complex world that we're living in. And I think that you cannot necessarily, as you talk about the stakeholder economy and, that engagement is so, so important. Whether it's your customers, whether it's your rights holders, your land right holders, it is really important to get that engagement from those specific communities. And you can't necessarily, you don't have, as you said, the boards are getting smaller, so you don't have enough seats at the table. And I also feel like, again, having guardrails and understanding where, there's that fine line between fiduciary decision making and advisory. And I mean, I'm curious on the 5% for Canada, how that I see, when I look at that, and we always sort of use it as a benchmark. Canada's always like 10% of what the US is, and funny enough, 5%, it's like 10% of the 54%. Are you seeing more? And I know you've been active in Canada recently and continue to do that. So from a Canadian perspective, I'd love to hear from you what you're seeing in that 5%. Like it's 5%. Like I'd love to know what the number is, because it's all relative, right?
Yeah. Well, it's 5% of the 2.6 million advisory board professionals around the world. It's really interesting. It was terrific being in Toronto, Deborah, running the certified chair program there just recently. I'm very excited about the ongoing development of the Canadian market. Because traditionally advisory boards, and we'll talk about this shortly, is in the business sector. And that's what Canada was actually leading the way in 2014 with regards to research in the advisory board sector, where 6% of businesses have advisory boards in Canada. That's just the business sector. Now we're broadening out into this corporate market that are using advisory boards in ways that we've never seen before. And so I think there's a lot of great opportunity happening in Canada. But one of the drivers that I think we should be really aware of with women on boards is the critical issue of the diminishing roles in the board of directors, potentially. And so just a few months ago, I met up with 50 CEOs in Africa who connected with me because they wanted to really road test their thinking and evaluate the role of advisory boards, particularly for women. When in Africa, as an example, the number of publicly listed companies that are now delisting means that there's diminishing governance board roles, and those governance boards are getting smaller. Diminishing number of governance boards, but we've got this whole stream of incredibly experienced and talented women coming through the pipeline. Where do they go if those roles aren't there? And so the human story is that everybody has an opportunity to contribute at this level. And we've got this incredible level of expertise. How do we harness that? By creating advisory boards in a part of an ecosystem of governance, and that's that governance system. I think this is an incredible opportunity for women to really shine in this space.
I think we'll have a follow-on conversation on that, because this is intriguing and you've got me at hello on this one. So I will come off screen and let you continue. Thank you, Louise.
Thanks, Deborah. Where do advisory boards fit in the landscape of advice? It's always a common sort of question. There's the advisor landscape really shifts from the informal through to the most formal levels. So advice is provided informally from family and friends through to peers in business, and then business network groups. This network group with Women Get on Boards is a really interesting sort of network group as an example of that. Then there's the one-to-one engagement between an accountant, business coach, mentor, consultant, expert advisor. Where it gets ethically challenging in that one-to-one engagement is when organisations, and in particular the business owner market, will expect one person to have the answer to everything. And so advisors generally will go there and provide advice in areas that's outside of their expertise just because they want to help. An advisory board is generally made up because there's a charter that has a really clear purpose. There's an independent chair. There are external advisors and internal representatives. They'll generally meet 4 times a year, and they'll measure impact at least annually. Then there's the governance board, which is the most serious undertaking. The market generally doesn't understand the difference between a governance board and advisory board. So that's a really important distinction that we've talked about already. But advisory boards are not all equal either. There's so many different variations to advisory boards. Informally, when a business owner in particular would not pay people, chair it themselves, but they kind of fizzle out over a period of time. On-demand advisor panels are really used a lot around the world for accelerators, but also investment funds. So we just supported the Singaporean government building out an advisor panel for 90 of their investments that they had. So it's a global advisory panel. Peer advisory boards is when you've got one chair and you've got multiple businesses around the table. They're very common, especially in the North American market. Advisory board of one is when a business or an organisation says, yes, we want an advisory board for the long term, but we want to grow into it slowly. So what they'll do is they'll recruit their chair first, work with their chair on a monthly basis to really learn their craft and build into best practice over time. The next stage generally will be they'll have their advisory board of one, then they'll bring in advisors as they need in. So the advisors pop in and they pop out. So pop-up advisory boards is a really practical way to start building up that scale. Now, project advisory boards, I will talk about that in more depth, is the big area of growth in advisory boards around the world. Then best practice advisory boards, when it's everything about the business, and I'll go through the most common models of that shortly. When we look at the market, we look at a few different lenses. We look at the emerging industry, we look at the business sector, corporatized advisory boards and project advisory boards. I'll just do a quick snapshot of each of those. Emerging businesses, generally 29% of advisory boards are in this part of the market. That's generally pre-revenue to 1.5 million in revenue. They're very volatile, so 45% volatility, which means they start something and then they have to shift. So fixed advisory board structures is problematic in that part of the market. So agile models like an advisory board of one, pop-up advisory board or advisor panels are a great way to be able to support businesses in this stage. The business sector is generally defined as the 1.5 to $100 million in revenue turnover. It's really interesting that the most common starting point for a business to have an advisory board is with revenue around 1.5 million. Now, you might think that's small, but I think it's really encouraging that businesses are actually shifting, and specifically female founders are shifting their use of advisors from supporters into actually really bespoke and fit for purpose advisors. And this is a very important trend that I'm very excited about. But the average size of a business with a advisory board in this part of the market is 20 million in revenue turnover, and generally they'll invest between $40,000 to $70,000 in their first year for their advisory board. So where does that investment go? They'll generally have internal representatives on the advisory board. They'll generally recruit an independent chair that will that's got a high level of commercial acumen, that will generally take about 3 months to establish the advisory board and get the business ready. Then they'll bring on their external advisors, and most commonly they'll bring in two people with very different backgrounds that are really chosen fit for purpose. So a governance board, as you know, generally will have a skills matrix. In an advisory board, they'll have a priority matrix. What are the priorities for the business at that period of time? And then recruit their advisory board members specifically to those priorities. And as the business changes, the advisory board changes. So it's a really agile approach. It's not a fixed structure. And we say it's never forever. So when the job is done, it either closes or it changes its narrative. The governance dilemma we've talked about already, which is driving the new activity in advisory boards in the corporate sector. So corporate advisory boards is generally when there's already a really well structured governance board, and then they build advisory boards around the governance board or around the executive. So where the governance board forms the strategy, the advisory board informs the strategy, and they're becoming very specialized. So it may be around sustainability, transformation, customer advisory boards, cyber, diversity and inclusion. This is becoming a really big area. Entering international markets or mergers and acquisitions, navigating geopolitical risk, having next generation input into strategy. These are all very exciting and very purposeful advisory boards to bring in specific domain expertise. It's what Procter & Gamble talk about in bringing the outside in. What that is also doing is really professionalising how the advisory board works within the organisation. So it needs to be done well. So it's giving rise to two new roles, the role of an advisory board manager, but also the professional independent chair, because it has to be done well when there's an existing ecosystem where governance, within governance and where decisions are already being made. Project advisory boards, I mentioned this is one of the exciting areas of growth. Now, we're all of business advisory board will generally look at everything about the overall business strategy. And a project advisory board just looks at a strategy. Like corporatized advisory boards, the business sector is also using project advisory boards in ways that we've never seen before. So in this report that we produced last year, 53% of new advisory boards are now project-based advisory boards. 2 years prior to that, it was 34%. And so what that's telling us is advisory boards traditionally were used because they're wanting to focus on growth and succession planning and navigating the future. What we're finding now is that organisations of all sizes are just trying to navigate today. And these advisory boards could be a 3-month really specific advisory board to focus on a particular thing or an ongoing thing. But I think the future of the advisory board sector is in this really agile approach to way advisory boards work for the longer term. Great return on investment structure. For the advisory board sector, as we mentioned, it's growing significantly around the world. Because of that growth, the nature of what an advisory board professional is also shifting. Above the surface, I'll just give you an example of our global community in 31 countries. 10% of our advisory board professionals are actually working within a professional firm, either as a partner or as a senior executive, adding advisory boards as part of their service offering to their clients. 60% of our members are portfolio professionals, so they might be doing governance boards and advisory boards, or consulting or lecturing, playing golf, whatever it is. They'll generally have 5 to 6 different gigs on at any given time, of which advisory boards is one of those. And I really love the fact that portfolio professionals are doing multiple things, not just one, so that way they stay really sharp and really connected with the market. Beneath the surface, though, is now the new advisory board sector in line with corporatised advisory boards, where 30% of our members actually don't charge out their time. They're actually building advisory boards inside their organisations, like the CEO of Coca-Cola in Shanghai, building quality advisory boards and really shifting committee structures, meeting structures into really bespoke and fit for purpose and energised advisory boards where they bring the outside in and really re-energise the way that decisions are being made. So it's an exciting and a very important part of the advisory board profession itself. We also find that those executives will have a view to have a portfolio later on in their career, but they're doing this now to learn their craft, add more value to their role, but then also creating a pathway to them for themselves into advisory boards as a portfolio later on. In that mix, there's also business owners who are wanting to exit their business. And I think Australia is very similar to Canada from my understanding, where we've got a lot of aging business owners wanting to manage their exit. And so many business owners in Australia, as an example, are shifting their role as being a business owner operator onto an advisory board, so that enables their executive team to step up and they can demonstrate the business can operate without them to get a higher multiple valuation for their business, but also a better exit and a sense of purpose. Once they've sold their business, give them a sense of purpose to support fellow entrepreneurs for their next stage. Now, best practice really matters as the advisory board profession continues to grow. We have a best practice and ethics advisory board that oversees the ongoing development of this framework. It's the ABF 101 advisory board best practice framework, which was originally released in 2020. It's just gone through its 3rd edition and was released just in this last month. And there are 5 key principles to best practice. We don't have best practice standards for advisory boards because it needs to be able to be agile in its approach for a startup, to the business market, to corporate. So you can't have one process because the market just doesn't work that way. So instead of being process-led, we have it being principle-driven. So those principles are a foundation to ethics for it to be applied in a way that's really fit for the environment of what that advisory board purpose is there to do. So it's around clarity of scope. What's the advisory board there to do? What it's not there to do. Around process of having structure and discipline. That doesn't mean constraint. Simplicity of an advisory board is the best thing, but it needs to have good rigor around it. And then measurement of impact. Then finally, it's around the people, around independence and fit for purpose. Now, when organisations generally think about building an advisory board, they go straight to the people. It's actually the last thing that happens. You've got to really think very carefully about what the purpose is, what structure will really drive that impact, and then evaluate what voices need to be around the table. So this really drives, quality and ethical frameworks in the way that advisory boards operate. So Deborah, that's the end of my show and tell.
Wow. I think you've brought a whole different dimension to the professionalization of advisory boards and the different types and different stages. But I love that you said it should be the people last as opposed to the people first. And I think you can liken that from a governance board. You need to understand the skills, the scope. You have to have all of those before you go out and determine best fit. So I think there's some parallels there. So we've got some questions, Louise, which is great. I know I have some questions for you too. So they've started coming in. So this one came in while you were presenting the slide on the growth trends. And maybe you did answer it, but I think in fairness, it was here in the question. It said, could you ask what percentage of boards have advisory boards? So I'm not sure if they're referring to governance boards. So maybe for clarity, Louise, when you're talking about an advisory board, it's not an advisory board to the board. Maybe that distinction differentiator might. And then you mentioned 6% of board in Canada use advisory boards. So maybe you can dispel that it is not the board that has the advisory board. It's the founder, the CEO, the company. Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, the advisory board sector, when we started the advisory board centre 7.5 years ago, before that, advisory boards, we could see that they were everywhere. And everyone was running around like a free-range chicken doing their own thing, right? Advisory boards can be called all sorts of different things. So that's part of the challenge about trying to really understand the scope of the advisory board sector, really how big it is. And we think we're just scratching the surface of how advisory boards are being used, because it could be called a committee. So if you think about a lot of governance structures, this is a conversation we just had in London with a focus group that we did with Hydrix and Struggles. A lot of committees within a governance structure, boards actually have never really thought about, is that committee actually a governance board? Is that committee making a decision? Or is it problem solving? Is it actually an advisory board in nature? So what this is doing is it's bringing governance boards back into remapping their committee structures to really think about which committees are actually making decisions and which ones aren't. And so that way, when we look at the advisory board sector itself, it's actually really hard to quantify how many are actually working in conjunction with the governance board. Now, the research that was done in Canada in 2014 by BDC, it was the first research that I found around the world around advisory boards, and that was particularly around the business sector. So the utilisation of advisory boards in the business market, so 6% of businesses. I think that's about right worldwide of when you're looking at businesses focusing on growth strategies, because OECD talk about high growth businesses are businesses that have 20% growth year in, year out for at least 3 years, and 6% of businesses are considered to be high growth businesses from the OECD. However, the market's now moved because it's not just about navigating growth. So our research shows that traditionally 75% of businesses, their primary motivation is to have an advisory board to really support a growth strategy.
So Louise,
yeah,
I know that you'll continue in this one. So
yeah.
I don't want to cut you short, but what I want to encourage, because the recording, your slides will come thereafter, is if anyone wants to reach out to you, because if we don't respond to all the questions or they want more clarity or they've read the report. So, because I think you could talk on this, like it's your baby. So maybe we'll move on. I think that giving examples was great. We have a few more questions and I do want to continue on that. I didn't want to cut you short. So again, if anybody wants to reach out to you after this, they can follow you on LinkedIn. I would imagine you're okay with that. Okay, so the next question is, does the firm change the advisory board chair with each project? So as you were saying, it's agile and you were talking about these project purpose-driven advisory boards. The question is, does the firm or the organization change the advisory board chair with each project?
Yes, they can, and they don't have to. So some organisations, like when we look at multinationals, we look at the university sector in Saudi Arabia, where they've just regulated advisory boards there. They'll change out their advisors, but they'll keep the chair as the continuity. What's important in a corporate environment, Deborah, is the critical relationship, we call it the golden triangle, between the chair, the sponsor, and the advisory board manager. And so very often we think about impact of an advisory board based around what happens at the table. What's equally important, and we're finding it is becoming increasingly important, is what happens before the advisory board and what happens after the advisory board to amplify that impact. And so that continuity that happens in that relationship between the sponsor, the chair, and the advisory board manager can be really powerful if the advisory board is project-based and it's a rolling advisory board.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking too, having that chair from a continuity perspective makes it easier. So then you've got the nuances so it certainly makes sense. And there'll be maybe the succession of that chair at some point in time. It's like, okay, you've served. Wait, actually, I don't know if you spoke too, but what would be, just to follow on to this, if I may ask, what is the typical term of a chair for an advisory board? Is it it would obviously be in the mandate or the charter, right? What do you see?
Yeah, but also the measurement of impact on an annual basis, because the priorities might have changed, and you might go that skills and experience that we've got with the chair as well as the advisors may no longer fit. And so reviewing it on an annual basis keeps the advisory board very intellectually honest, so to speak.
Love it.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying it's a 5 to 7 year term and we'll just keep it in perpetuity. We'll review it annually. That's what you're saying is best practice.
That's right. When the job is done, you finish it. Yeah.
Which is great. So lots of great questions. Alison, I see you on screen, but I'm going to ask you a question. Do you see companies using their advisory boards as a testing ground or a funnel for directors for their governance boards?
Absolutely. It's a great try before you buy, right? So on both sides. And so we find that often individuals are approached to sit on a governance board and they go, well, actually, I'm not sure whether I should or shouldn't, especially in the business sector. And they'll very often talk about, let's build an advisory board first. Let's make sure there's a really good fit. And then if it is, then we can actually use that to then test the ground for many. Also, the pipeline for executives. When you look at internal executives and potentially, and also the development of women, you can't just go from zero to best practice overnight. So how is it that people actually get to learn their craft? So advisory boards and project-based advisory boards inside large organisations is a great way to do that as a bit of a testing ground. For emerging businesses or businesses that are growing, they'll build an advisory board first that are used to scale their governance. And when they get to a particular milestone, they'll then shift that advisory board into a governance board, or there's no longer needing an advisory board. They then need a different skill set at the governance board.
Yeah, and I've worked with a lot of founders in the past, and their natural inclination is when they're doing their sort of rounds of financing is like, well, great, this angel investor put 50K in, and I'm going to put that person on the board. And it's like, well, wait a sec, you've got to protect that governance board. Maybe they could be an advisor. So I think that's a whole nother dynamic. And I know, Allison, with Innovation Factory, you work with a lot of early stage companies, and making sure that people actually understand what their role is, and and sometimes conflicts when you're putting your own money in as an angel investor. Are you really objective and from a fiduciary? So I don't want to take away from the next set of questions, but some great conversations. And so Allison was very keen to have another question in there, but Allison, I think what I'll do is I'll go to the other questions first, and then I'll come back to yours. And Marilyn, I love your question. So this was at top of mind as well. Does the Advisory Board Center actively recruit for advisory board members? And if not, if it's not an advisory board placement and it's a growing area of practice, do the traditional executive search firms recruit for advisory boards?
Yes. So I'll just say all of the above, right? So the Advisory Board Centre is a professional body. We're not a recruitment agency. However, organisations come to us when they don't know what they need or who they need. We provide two services to the market. One is a free service to help them scope out their advisory board structure if they don't know what they need, and then connect them into the advisory board community with their job board. The other one is that for organisations that want to implement best practice and want to show independence in the way they've developed best practice, they come to us, and we provide a service to multinationals, large organisations, government, who want to demonstrate that independence in the development of best practice. So that's that. Then board recruitment firms, like the CEO of Hydrix and Struggles in London for their board practice. She is a certified chair. So she's certified, she's part of our global community. They're building advisory boards in as part of their service offering. They just released a report this week, and I'm catching up with them next week, where they're looking at that relationship between the governance board and advisory boards and the evolution of advisory boards. And so it's a very important part of their practice.
Maybe it's a tie into one of your slides that you had earlier on, and we had a conversation around it's a hot governance trend, right? And I forget where did that quote come from? Which firm was that quote from?
That came from Financial Times.
Oh, was it Financial Times? Okay. So if it's emerging, I think inevitably it stands to reason that there will be a business case here and an ROI. So, so if maybe I'll extend the question from Marilyn, is if some of our community today was interested in advisory boards, we'll get the occasional advisory boards and we'll post those out. Absolutely. So Louise, if you have people that are looking specifically in Canada, we have a complimentary service. We are very happy to post that out. We have a very engaged community that you can see some showing up today. But what would it take, like, if any of our members were interested in your advisory board center, and I don't know if it becomes if you become a member, or I know you've got your certified chair program, maybe can you speak to that a little bit? And then I'll come back to Allison's next question.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. So we run the Certified Chair Executive Program. It is the cornerstone credential for advisory board professionals. It's the only credential for advisory board professionals in the world. And that is everything as a foundation to what best practice is. So what is it that you do to establish an advisory board, set it up, manage it, refresh it? And what are the ethical boundaries around that and the methodology that sits behind it? So the chair certification is a 2-day program up front, and then our members, people who complete the credential become part of our global advisory board community, of which they get access to around 40 hours of professional development a year. And the ethics frameworks and the Global Research Council and everything else that goes with that. So we run that program around the world, and we just ran it in Toronto, which was really exciting. And I was so happy because the weather was so beautiful, and and I guarantee I probably won't be there in winter, but
No, we won't recruit you in the wintertime here. So you're planning one, you've got a few, so
yeah.
the community here, anyone can always go look at your website. There, I saw there's a certified chair program. They can go and look and see, because you've got some also in the US next year as well as Toronto.
We do, yeah. So we've got a virtual program in December this year. Looking forward to going to New York in April, and then running a program back into Toronto to meet up with all our colleagues and friends there in June next year.
Wonderful. Maybe what we can do for you is specifically for the Toronto one or the other ones in New York, we can post out to our members when they're coming up. So we can take that offline, because I certainly wanted to go to the Toronto one, except Keisha and I were out in Vancouver. So thank you. We've got a question and we're open. We probably have maybe 1 or 2 other questions, but Allison, rather than me not quoting you, you're sitting there, I'm going to ask you to ask your next question, because I just see, and I love what you've said and your question. So maybe introduce yourself and ask your question.
Terrific. Thanks, Deborah. And thank you, Louise. That was, I really enjoyed your presentation. So I sit on a number of boards, both not-for-profit and a corporate board. I was really interested in your concept of a governance system. I love that. And I wondered if you could share some examples with us of how do you integrate an advisory board with the governance board? Like, where did that overlapping area, how do you make that work?
It's a great question, and the answer to that is very carefully. So
yes, role clarity.
Absolutely. To establish an advisory board in the business sector, it takes 3 months. In a corporate environment, generally it takes 6 months. It may take longer. Like universities, generally they take longer, because there's so many different things to consider, because there's an existing environment there. We have a methodology that which is called the decision-making matrix. We call it the big bad boy, right? Because there's a lot of things to consider internally when doing it, and consultation as well. And that's that mapping of, first of all, what is it you're trying to do? What you're trying to achieve? What are the priorities? What are the key priorities? And we always talk about the top 3 priorities for the advisory board. What is it there to do and not do? Once that clarity is found, it's then looking at the relationships with other functions inside the organisation. Like, what's the relationship between the reporting line between the governance board and the advisory board? Is it to the chair? Is it to a director? Is it to an executive? Is information confidential? Is information not confidential? Who reports back on the outcomes of the advisory board? Is it the chair only, or is it the chair and the executive back to the board? Or is there something else? And this is really important for multinationals, especially when you've got an advisory board in market supporting a CEO in a market that reports back to a governance board in another market. And a lot of that depends then on the literacy in international markets of that particular governance board. And so there's so many different things to consider. And so that's why it takes generally about 6 months to really do that very carefully, pilot test it, make sure it's really safe. And really clear. But, having said that, if a organisation has a really clear mandate and project base around the advisory board, it may take 3 to 6 months. Like the King Abdullah University in Jeddah, It took them 6 months to do it because it was just regulated. And so they had a really clear mandate from the Crown Prince. That's what they needed to do. So they just went and did it. It's about then implementing best practice as part of that methodology.
Thank you. Marilyn, I'm not sure if we answered your question, because you've got another follow-on. Is that where one can find these opportunities? Marilyn, I don't know if Louise answered your question, and you are very welcome to come on screen if you want. Maybe not. I don't. There you are, Marilyn. Hey, Marilyn.
Yes, I'm in the basement and my internet connection is not great. So I had to kind of step out of a meeting. You've answered my question. Thank you very much. And I was quite excited about this, and it's delivered more this session than I thought. So thank you.
Thanks, Marilyn. I just want to make sure you got, yeah. Louise, I don't know if you want to comment.
I do. Advisory boards is a really creative space, right? So it's not necessarily waiting for opportunities. You can create opportunities by your genuine sense of curiosity and wanting to help, and then evaluating what are the different ways that you're going to address it, of which advisory boards is just one way. But this is where it's exciting, because you're being optimistic about the future, you're wanting to contribute, and this is where the real opportunities really get created.
If I can just make a comment, Deb, I've been looking for board seats, as you know, and what I'm finding is that where I'm spending my time is more in advisory all the time, and I'm thinking, well, maybe that's a better space for me. So I thought it's kind of exciting, actually.
Thinking same, Marilyn. I think this collaboration beginning with Advisory Board Center, I was very intrigued with the report and asked Louise to speak here. I think you'll have a good following for your certification program next year, Louise. And I do think there's quite a few of us that are in those. I think it can be creative and you can be curious. And so, Marilyn, I feel the exact same way as you.
Yeah, thank you. You know what I love about the connection between Canada and Australia is there's real connection with nature. And when you think about things naturally happening, like naturally happening for you, Marilyn, with advisory, you just go with where the flow is. And there is just a natural flow with regards to advisory boards being just so useful.
So I'm mindful of time. Kirsten just put in, thank you, Kirsten, is like, hey, this is great. You've got a podcast. So she sent a link of one of your recent podcasts. So, Keisha, let's make sure in our follow-up we capture that as well. So, Louise, any parting words before I thank you officially and do some administrative and close out the session? Anything else you'd like to add to our very engaged audience today?
I really value the work that you're doing, Deborah, for bringing women onto boards. I just want to mention the incredible market to support female founders in the advisory board space. So women supporting women is a really important part of this market. So it's not just being about boards, but also really supporting those female founders out there, where advisory boards is a great model to be able to support them.
And trust me, I have another initiative, which is Women Funding Women, for that very reason, to support female founders. So you find yourself in these intersectionality. So Louise, thank you so much. We are delighted. Your passion, your insights were phenomenal. You can see it comes from your heart, and you can see your global impact and approach to bringing this professionalization for advisory boards, which I think is phenomenal. We want to thank you for your time. We donate to our charity partner, which is Dress for Success Toronto chapter, for your time. So thank you. We want to thank Advisory Board Center for being our sponsor for today for our speaker series. So thank you to Advisory Board Center. And we also want to just acknowledge that we have our next, I was going to say advisory board meeting. That will be in time. We have our next speaker series, which is on November 25th. Save the date. KPMG is our sponsor, and it's going to be on emerging audit committee trends in 2025. So stay tuned. It's same time, noon to 1 on November 25th. And again, there'll be a follow-up with the slides, with the recording, with some additional links that have been provided. And Louise, if there's anything else you want us to link out, please send out to Keisha. I just want to thank you all for joining us today. Great engagement, lots of learning. Thank you, and may your board work be broadened with advisory boards. And we are very happy to promote any opportunities. We've got a very active and engaged community. So thank you, Louise. And I'll let you, I don't know if you're going to go back to bed at 3 a.m. or you're up for the day.
No, I'm going straight to bed.
Okay. Thank you so much for making the time for us.
Thanks, Deborah. Bye-bye.
Bye.